Welcome back to another installment of Some Guy Complains About Other People's Hard Work, otherwise known as YouTube. In a previous video, we analyzed all the Latin used in episode 1 of Netflix's new series, Barbarians. Well, now we're going to do that for episode 2. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. Let's get right into the first scene of episode 2 that uses Latin.
Ego salutem tibi dico, Romae legate.
Eius sonus omnino mihi intolerandus.
So, of course, we have a German actor playing a barbarian, as they're called here. And it's Segestes, a figure who's even noted in history. And he says, Ego salutem tibi dico, Romae legate. And anything he does that's not congruent with classical Latin or Vulgar Latin of this period, which are essentially the same thing, of course, in this period, is acceptable to me because the actor has a German accent. He's not trying to imitate a good-sounding, native-sounding pronunciation, and why should he? His character is very interesting because he's even clean-shaven and speaks some Latin, unlike the rest of his kin, which makes him stand out as somewhat Romanized, but it's interesting, I think, in the show how well they demonstrate that this guy, this Segestes, doesn't truly fit in either Roman or Germanic society, at least this character in the show, which I think is well and clearly portrayed. As for his Latin, it's a fantastic normal Latin greeting, salutem tibi dico. We say that today as we speak Latin. We speak Latin every day. Just so you know, Latin's a spoken language. Today. Not a native language, but it's a spoken language. Good, just as long as we're clear. Vowels responds, Eius sonus omnino mihi intolerandus. And I think every sound is perfect. There is the protracted S, and I already talked about that extensively in the previous video in this series. And of course, we wouldn't expect an Italian actor to be able to do that very easily, but everything else sounds fantastic. Vowel lengths, pronunciation, Eius sonus omnino mihi intolerandus. Glorious.
Eius sonus omnino mihi intolerandus.
Something else I particularly love about it is how Italian he sounds. Intolerandus. That lovely Italian cadence. So good.
Tamquam moichae cuius dame dentulae, quae poetari conetur.
This appears to be a slave of Varus, who is acting as a clerk. His name is Pelagios, or Pelagios. And the actor here is played by Nikolai Kinski, who, despite that lovely name, is actually French-American and also speaks German. He's trilingual. And by the way, if you haven't seen this show yet, there may be some spoilers for the episode that I talk about, especially if you aren't familiar with this period in history. Now, I love what Pelagios says is tamquam moichae or moichae. What's interesting is he says moichae, and he says it with a ch.
Tamquam moichae cuius dame dentulae, quae poetari conetur.
Now, this character, his name is Pelagios, and many slaves, especially highly educated slaves, including this interpreter for Varus, were Greek. They were from Greece, and this one, he speaks Latin. He, of course, would probably speak his native Greek, and he speaks the Germanic language of this particular people. That's very impressive. To that end, he also has a, what I would say, non-native sounding Latin accent, which we would also expect. The actor, of course, is not Italian, so he doesn't sound like an Italian. So this is good. We would expect a character such as this not to sound like Varus or Metellus. So this is great. And he also, and what I really like here is he's saying moichae. So there's a development where the Greek letter, which we in English usually call chi, which in modern Greek today is pronounced he. This letter, he or chi, it is pronounced in ancient Greek, depending on the time period, as a k. Now, around this time period, during the Roman Empire, exactly when is hard to determine, but I have videos where I talk about that, it changes into a ch sound and changes into a fricative sound instead of the aspirate sound. Now, this actor happens to pronounce it that way, moichae instead of moichae, which is maybe what we'd expect a Latin speaker to do. And since this is the time period where that kind of change was beginning in Greek speech, it's fantastic. So this native Greek speaking character is having a feature which is somewhat unique to at least some speakers of Greek, possibly in this time period. It just seems like a really nice detail to me, whether it's deliberate or not, and I love it. So, tam quam moichai cuius tam e dentulai quae poetari conetur. And he doesn't do everything perfectly. He doesn't have all the vowel lengths perfect. Again, this is a non-native Latin speaker, so I wouldn't expect him to necessarily get everything right anyway. Of course, ancient Greek retains phonemic vowel length in many speakers well through the Roman Empire, just like Latin, so there's no reason for him natively not to be able to do a long vowel, but he's not a native speaker. Maybe he gets one wrong. It's fine.
Tam quam moichai cuius dam edentulae quae poetari conetur.
I like these words. The translator, I think, is fantastic. Edentulus is an adjective for toothless. Poetari, not a super commonly used verb, but it's a verb to make poetry. What's interesting is that there are a lot of verbs in Greek which you don't have a lot of in Latin, so Latin doesn't create verbs very naturally or very easily by its nature, whereas Greek does. So the fact that a character who is a native Greek speaker is using a verb where we don't necessarily expect a Roman to use a verb, although it exists in classical Latin, this verb poetari, it's a deponent verb to make poetry, just screams authenticity to me.
Nomen est segestis.
Adrem barbare.
And that's all that's in this first scene. Nomen est segestes, the use of the Latin idiom, is fantastic, normal. Adrem barbare, the nice laconic sounding Latin out of the soldier's mouth, works really well for me. An interesting note is that the Romans comment on foreign pronunciations of Latin. For example, in Petronius, there is a character who complains about how horrible it sounds when a native Greek speaker, such as a slave, tries to recite Latin poetry. I'm specifically thinking of a scene from the Cena Trimalchionis, the Dinner of Trimalchio, in the book The Satyricon by Petronius in chapter 68, where he says that the slave recites the Aeneid in a sing-songy voice, canora voce, and a line from the Aeneid, interia mediae neas iam classi tenebat. In a sing-songy voice, the ancient Greeks, of course, had a pitch accent, similar to Japanese.
This is my father. This is my mother. This is my maza.
Similar, also possibly, to Norwegian.
The Norwegians always end everything by jumping an octave. You know, they love ski jumping and they talk like they're ski jumping, like, oh, here comes another smith. You know, they're always...
So I can only imagine what this might have sounded like coming out of the mouth of a Greek speaker, as reported by this ancient Latin author. Interea mediae neas iam classi tenebat. I really don't know what he must have done that was typically foreign sounding, but it offended his ears, as he says here. Nullus sonos unca gidior percussit aures meas, nam paraiter errandis barbari aut aediectum aut de minutum clamorem, miscebat at LLiNYCos versus, utum primo mediam Vergilius offenderit. So he doesn't like how this sounds at all. What I like about that, and what I feel the translators maybe even including in this, if not the actual scriptwriter, is the fact that you have a native Greek speaker, the ones who usually get made fun of in Roman literature for having an annoying accent, making fun, along with Varus, this Germanic speaker who clearly has an accent. So for me, hearing all these languages, feeling this history all at once, it just, I love this scene linguistically. It works for me really well.
Duc mi ad folcuni pagum, barbare. Si mentitus est, te iubebo in cruce figi.
Fantastic. Lovely line, too. Duc mi ad folquini pagum, barbare. Si mentitus est, te iubeo in cruce figi, is more how I would read it. The only thing at all to complain about is that he says cruce figi, and each syllable has the same weight or time on it, the amount of duration, whereas cruce, 2 short syllables, and then figi. In isolation, each word would sound fine because it's a matter of relative sound, but in cruce figi, it all has the same duration. So in cruce figi, like that, with those durations, is what I would expect to hear in this sentence. Otherwise, everything else sounds really good. Folquini, I think that sounds good. I also note how the actor is pronouncing not folkvini, not even using the pronunciation of modern German or something. He's not trying to imitate the language which is standing in for the Germanic language in this ancient time, but he's using his native w sound because he doesn't have v in his native Latin, which is really nice.
Duc mi ad folcuni pagum, barbare. Si mentitus est, io bevo in cruce fighi.
Not only is the pronunciation by the actor Gaetano here sounding excellent, but the usage of the Latin idiom done by the translator Alessandro Balistrieri, it sounds wonderful. I really love the usage of these particular terms.
Gentes sunt interesse discordes, tamen apud eas ego magnum momentum avere possum remno vai optimam, si ego rex gentis mea esse.
Based on what you've already heard from me, what do you think Segestes did here that wouldn't be native-sounding classical Latin for this time period? Now, Segestes, the character, isn't a native speaker of Latin, so there's no reason he should have anything other than an accent which reflects his native language, and the stand-in for his native language is, of course, modern German, so he has a modern German accent. Also, his accent isn't the least bit offensive to me. I have many German friends who speak Latin very fluently, and they sound very good. Some of them have strong accents, and they still sound fantastic. Accents are fine. Accents are fun. So the fact that Varus complains about being offended by the German accent, of course, is typical hyperbole. But it's meant to portray his character, which is that of the overbearing, arrogant Roman. And in that sense, I think it works well insofar as it portrays his character in that way. Whether or not the Romans should be portrayed that way. And one more note, because despite my having talked about it in the first video, a lot of people in the comments of the previous video said how, oh, I don't like how modern German is being used in the video. This is a German show for a German audience. The main characters are German, including Arminius. Varus and Metellus, the other Latin speakers, are not the main characters. So they are supporting cast members. This is from the Germans' point of view, the Germanic people's point of view. Would I love it if they attempted to reconstruct a Proto-Germanic language for this time period? Yes, I think it would be fantastic to attempt such a thing, but there's no reason this show couldn't have just been done completely in German. There's no reason that the Romans, to do a show for a German audience, have to speak Latin. The fact that they do, and their classical Latin sounds really good, is something that we should praise. If they want to do Proto-Germanic, I'll help, but that'll be for a different show, for a different audience.
In Germaniam non perveni, qui honoribus tuis essem subsidio, barbare.
So in this sentence that Varus says, in Germaniam non perveni, qui honoribus tuis essem subsidio, the only thing I complain about here is one vowel length. He says subsidio instead of subsidio. It's a short E. He shortens the E in the end of perveni, but as we discussed in the previous video, this is a common feature of Latin, both literary and spoken, to shorten the final long E to simply E. So he says perveni, and it sounds really good. He also has the native Italian style mixing of vowels exactly like classical Latin, exactly like Vulgar Latin as well, of this time period. Qui honoribus, the H you don't hear, the vowels blend together. It sounds exquisitely good. It's exactly the way I try to do it myself. So props to Gaetano. Something else that more than a few people mentioned to me in the comments was, well, why they wouldn't be just speaking in one way in ancient Rome, and I know. But both in the previous video and in this one, you'll hear me complimenting the translation and the pronunciation where they're doing things that are not completely standard or correct or whatever you want to think of it when it comes to classical Latin, because it demonstrates that exact wonderful variety. So where I do critique things, for example, where he says subsidio, there is almost no way that is going to have that sound in this century. That's why I'm picking on it. Again, this actor doesn't speak Latin natively. He's an actor doing a fantastic job performing in a language that he doesn't know fluently, using a pronunciation that, as an Italian, no doubt is already foreign to him. So Gaetano and all the actors get my praise for what they're doing. Nevertheless, saying subsidio instead of subsidio is not a representation of the sound of Latin in any speaker's voice who is a native speaker in this 1st century AD time period. And that's why I'm critiquing it, just to clarify.
Veniam a te peto legata, sed viri mei consimiles tibi opus erat. Censeo mi melius esse, una vobiscum non videri legate.
In eunte quitato, iuxta latus meum eris, barbare. Ipse dixisti, uiros tui consimiles, mi opus fore.
Wow, that sounds really good. Not Segestes, of course. He sounds fine, just a light German accent. Wadu sounds really good. Let's listen to him again.
In eunte quitato, iuxta latus meum eris, barbare. Ipse dixisti, uiros tui consimiles, mi opus fore.
I found a couple tiny things to nitpick. Eniunte quitatu, as the cavalry comes in, iuxta latus meum. So here he says latus meum, and I transcribed all of this myself, by the way, just by listening. So number one, that tells you this is good Latin. I'm used to speaking Latin on a daily basis. So the fact that this Latin is spoken well enough and acted well enough and translated well enough to sound normal to me so that I can just transcribe it without any issue is demonstrative of that this is well pronounced and well written. But I was particularly confused when he said latus meum, iuxta latus meum. I was like latus sum, and I heard the word sum, which means I am sum, and I'm trying, and then I heard eum, sumeum. Like, what is he saying? And the reason was because he's adding the schwa vowel, latus meum, after the s here. And as we discussed in a previous video, this is a typical feature of Italian speakers of Latin, as well as other people who have a native language which ends predominantly with vowels. They add a little schwa vowel or some other kind of little vowel because they're not used to saying latus. They would prefer to say latusu or latus or something. And so that's not what we should hear. We should hear latus meum. This is how I would read it. Eniunte quitatu, iuxta latus meo eris barbare, ipse dixisti. Viros tui consimiles mi opus fore. So Gaetano, the actor here, pronounced it very nearly the way I did. One thing he didn't do is he didn't extend the vowel length in dixisti. And the reason we know this vowel is long, even though it's within a closed syllable here, and that it must be dixi and not merely dixi, is that the Italian word is dissi. And because it's an E sound, it didn't open into an E. If it were a short dixisti, as this actor pronounced it, it would have to be dessi instead of dissi, but it is dissi in Italian. So instead of dixisti, we should hear dixisti.
In eunte quitato, iuxta latus meum eris, barbare. Ipse dixisti, uiros tui consimiles, mi opus fore.
Everything else sounds really good, particularly the fact that Italians natively, when there's an N in front of an S, they usually pronounce it with a kind of nasalization, and we know this feature to be a part of the pronunciation of Latin in the classical period as well. So he doesn't say consimiles with a hard N, he says consimiles, consimiles. It sounds completely native, fantastic for us to imitate.
Ab hinc Roma, mater vestra erit, egoque pater.
Danke.
Gratias. Danke. Gratias.
Gratias.
Sounds great. I hardly have any complaints at all. Let's listen again and see what we can find.
Ab hinc Roma, mater vestra erit, egoque pater.
Danke.
Gratias. Danke. Gratias.
Gratias.
The scansion is great. The syllable lengths all work very, very well. If I'm going to nitpick, and that's what you're here for, then I would say that he makes the ab hinc too heavy of his first syllable. He says, sounds more like abhink instead of abink. I just make that H silent when I speak normally. But you could add, you could say abhink, but the first syllable ought to be short. It's also stressed on the hink, but it sounds fine. It sounds like a completely plausible version of how that word could be uttered by a person living at this time. I'm fine with it. He also says, abhink Roma mater vestra erit. And there's this emphasis on the erit, which is usually characteristic of really anyone who doesn't speak a language where the verb comes at the end of the sentence. Again, he speaks natively Italian, and other people who speak English natively, or you name the Western European language, typically will not put the emphasis on the correct word. The word to be you will be, it was, and so forth, I am. Those words tend to be enclitic or underemphasized. So it's definitely not wrong the way he's saying it. It could also be he's emphasizing it that way for a point. So he's saying, abinc Roma mater vestra erit. The intonation of it to me, though, sounds more like he's trying to say it like this. Abinc Roma mater vestra erit, where you would expect the cadence to kind of fall and the intonation to be reduced on erit. But I do think it sounds okay in this sentence, especially given the context. I think the whole thing sounds perfectly pulled right out of the 1st century AD. I'm fine with it. I'd like a little more retracted S, but you know that. Otherwise, the other part, which is egoque pater, I hear a long O, or certainly a stressed O in egoque pater, and it sounds fine, especially the fact that we have that long O. Final O is always long in Latin. It can be shortened, but this sounds really good to me. I love the egoque pater. Something really interesting to me is that in a final syllable, in Latin, if there's a final S or an M or whatever final consonant, a T, Italian speakers tend to reduce that vowel, the quality of it. So it's not merely gratias or gratias, but gratias, gratias. Sounds a little bit more like, almost like Catalan or something. It's beautiful. I really like it. Here, though, of course, it's a long vowel, so we'd expect it to be gratias. I'd like it to be a little bit longer sounding. I think it's fine, though.
Abinc Roma mater vestra erit. Egoque pater.
Danke.
Gratias. Danke. Gratias.
Gratias.
The way he laughs here, this is more of a cinematic note. The way he laughs here, I think, is supposed to be part of his character. I think Gaetano is doing this very well as portraying Varus as being arrogant, looking down on the Germanic peoples because, well, whenever anyone speaks with an accent, it's hilarious.
Maza.
Accents are wonderful and funny and fun. And of course, this boy, Arminius, this is his first time speaking Latin. He's going to have an accent. And it's very normal to find an accent funny. It always sounds great. But I think the actor, Gaetano, the way he's choosing to laugh here is meant to show Varus as being particularly mean about it and kind of condescending. I think it does that well, don't you?
Gratias et tibi agre, quodeos bene tractavisti.
The way Pelagios here, he says, gratias tibi agere, it sounds like that sing-songy, that canora voce, that Petronius complains about in the Satyricon. So I think that's, I don't know if that's deliberate or if it's part of the native accent of the actor, Nikolai. But if this character is Greek, which he seems to be based on his name alone, I think it sounds fantastic. Really brings me into the authenticity. Gratias tibi agere. The only thing that I think is unusual is that there's the subjunctive here. This is the imperfect subjunctive, agerem. I would thank you. Quodeos bene tractavisti. Some long vowels are off. Again, he's a foreign speaker, so I'm not going to pick on that. But maybe this was something in the translation. In the English translation, it's simply, I thank you. The German is, ich danke dir, I thank you. Why would it be imperfect subjunctive? I don't really know. It's fine, though. It certainly works, even though the Latin and the German spoken by the Reik don't quite match up. I don't think it's a problem. It's maybe the translator, or the interpreter rather, Pelagios, maybe the character was thinking he was going to say something else. Doesn't really matter. I like it a lot.
Ambo ingenio erant praedet et obsequio.
Also, fantastic idiomatic Latin. Compliments again to the translator, Alessandro Balistrieri. Ambo ingenio erant praediti et obsequio. Wonderful usage. This construction, this idiomatic construction, praedidus, ingenio in this case, in praedidus obsequio, to be gifted with a certain characteristic is a way to describe a person's character. It's very good, very idiomatic Latin. I love seeing it here. It feels like Caesar. It feels like normal native spoken Latin of this period. Pronunciation-wise, let's give it another listen.
Ambo ingenio erant praedet et obsequio.
So much beautiful stuff in this line. I even hear what sounds closer to a retracted S in his obsequio. Obsequio, tiny problem, he says obsequio, the longer E pronunciation. You know, we've already heard this before. Otherwise, it sounds really good, that particular word. Also, the way he says praediti, it sounds a little bit closer to praediti or praediti. almost leaning towards prediti, which we know is a rustic Latin pronunciation and eventually becomes the dominant pronunciation of Latin in the following centuries, because that's how the ae, the I diphthong, is inherited into the Romance languages as e. And I don't think it's particularly easy for an Italian to do that, or maybe he's able to mix his Italian way of saying a word like maestro, which is in fact 2 syllables, and not easy. Like usually when I hear Italians say a word like this and they want to use the classical pronunciation, instead of saying brae, they say brae, and it sounds super awkward. He's not doing that here. He sounds really good. He's even merging into something which sounds very much what I would expect a native speaker to do in this time period. I really like it. Last little nitpick, he says errante, and so there's, every time I hear him say it and I'm looking at my own transcription, I'm like, where's that, is there a te in there? Where's this word? Oh, okay, because he's just adding he's saying errante praediti. So again, to our wonderful Italian audience out there, grazie, by the way, that you're watching this. Make sure you don't do that if you're interested in having a native sounding Latin pronunciation from the classical period. Make sure you're saying errant praediti without saying errante praediti. Avoid that kind of little syllable. It's not easy to do. I recognize that. It takes some practice.
Arminius nunc praefectus merita latere meo.
Sounds stupendous. This scene and pretty much every other, I never have any trouble with understanding it. I wasn't looking at the subtitles the first time I watched this scene and every other scene when they were speaking Latin, because I could just understand it because it was that well done. Occasionally there was like a what, and usually it's because of this little schwa that some of the Italian actors were inserting, which would trip me up, and I was like, wait, what word is that? And it's like sum, and there was no u in there at all, no actual meant to be a vowel in there. Those are the only times I would have trouble understanding. This is another beautifully pronounced line which sounds like how I would speak with my friends if I'm talking about an officer being joined to my side.
Ubi est aquila nostra?
Wo ist unsere Standard?
Sounds perfect. Ubi est aquila nostra. The vowel length, syllable length sounded fine because he says aquila quickly. He doesn't have the thing that we heard Metellus do in the previous episode where he says aquila, which if he were emphasizing the word or if he were saying it slowly, we might hear that kind of mistake. Again, typical of Italian phonotactics, but he doesn't do it here. It's really good. Ubi est aquila nostra. Right out of the 1st century AD. Sounds good.
Ubi est aquila nostra?
Wo ist unsere Standard?
Qui de homine quiem furatus est?
Der Mann, der sie gestohlen hat.
Quin Wolfsper?
Qui de homine quiam furatus est. Sounds fantastic. If you added the retracted s, that would be the only thing I could possibly imagine here. It just sounds so good. Notice also the blending of vowels between syllables. This is a mandatory part of Latin, this synaleephy that I spoke about in the previous episode. And of course, as a native Italian speaker, a language which does this natively, he does it flawlessly. I just love it so much. Sounds great.
Ubi est ille?
Wo ist er?
Neque semus
Du
ervare.
kannst ihn nicht retten.
The only thing that tripped me up here when I first listened to it without looking at the subtitles was he says, nequis. And I was like, nequis? Because it's actually nequis. A short first ne, and then a long e. So nequis is what I would expect to hear with this verb. And, you know, it's not everything's perfect, but everything else sounds extremely good. Love it. Go Gaetano.
Ein Barbar verrät seine Leute nicht.
Barbaros nationes suas umquam prodere negat.
Sounds really good for an L2 speaker of Latin in ancient times.
Barbarus ipse moralis.
So nice to hear this. Cicero coined the word moralis. It sounds very good the way he's pronouncing it. Barbarus ipse moralis. Note how Latin, in its laconic expression here by this military man, the verb to be, which is of course we talked about being enclitic, isn't often very important in Latin sentences the way it's important in other languages.
Barbarus ipse moralis.
Do you hear how he said moralis? One more time.
Barbarus ipse moralis.
Bravissimo Gaetano. Moralis, with a long O. He's not rushing through it and saying moralis, he's saying moralis. Maybe the dialect coach helped him there, maybe it's by accident, maybe it's totally deliberate, but it is perfect. Barbarus ipse moralis.
Piget quod cernere nequiris quemad modum puertus vir fieret.
Lovely line, especially the translation, in particular the use of biget for to cause shame or to be embarrassed. Wonderful. Biget quod cernere nequires, quad modum puertus vir fieret. So I sound a little bit different, right? the way I do that, not just because of retracted S, but because of my attention to the syllable lengths. I think the actor is doing almost all of them acceptably, if not perfectly. They sound really good for the most part. Something's a little off. The main thing I will pick on is that he says quemadmodum instead of queadmodum, allowing the synallophy to occur. It's, again, a difficult thing to get used to, especially when you're used to seeing Latin your whole life, and no doubt this actor studied a bit when he was younger, if not more recently, and few people ever get taught that final M is not a true consonant. So it should be queadmodum instead of quemadmodum. Otherwise, really nicely done, this line. Also interesting, listen to how he says wir.
Piget quod cerner nequiris quemad modum puertus vir fieret.
Now the way he says wir, which he's not saying like weird, he's not saying like he's saying weird. It's something in between, right? And this is not this isn't like weird or something, like, I don't know who would do that. But it sounds extremely good, and that's because the ancient grammarians of the classical period talk about this. There is a reduced quality to the E. He's not saying weird. It's not so bright. It's somewhat reduced, the vowel quality, and it's amazing.
Piget quod cerner nequiris quemad modum puertus vir fieret.
It's not really I. What we have is this blending of the W and the E together. I love this because a pronunciation like this is described by ancient Roman grammarians, that it's not strictly weird in this word. It's not a bright E sound, but most people, they attested, said something closer to weird. It's something kind of mixed together. Really cool. I love that we're hearing it here. While I doubt this was coached, I love the authenticity of it because this kind of pronunciation or something very close to it is attested. Maybe this is happening because we have the descendant of the Latin voice in this actor, and if we reverse engineer certain parts of it, specifically just the changing of V to W, and they mix together, his native naturalness with that one little tweak does it perfectly, just like sticking a plunger on the tail of a chicken to get a dinosaur walk. Look at this. This is amazing. Here we have a regular old chicken, and now we see what happens. We take a chicken and we put a plunger on the back of it, simulating a tail. Its gait changes, it walks like a dinosaur. This is exactly, exactly like taking in Italian, the descendant of a native Latin speaker, and changing the V to W and changing the other sounds back to the way they were. You have the authenticity of that native voice with just one little change or a few little changes, and it's perfect. Flawless analogy. This is from a 2014 study called Walking Like Dinosaurs, Chickens with Artificial Tails Provide Clues About Non-Avian Theropod Locomotion. Also, paleontologist Jack Horner is trying to do something exactly like this, changing which features develop in a controlled chicken embryo so that it can hatch with a tail and claws and teeth. Let's look at that face. That is a pet in need of a home, if I ever saw one. But dinosaur? But dinosaur? But dinosaur? But dinosaur? But dinosaur.
Indica mi obieste ius sedes.
I love this line for several reasons. Number one, perfect pronunciation. Nothing even really to nitpick on. In particular, there's the usage of me. Now notice that this one character, he says me sometimes, he says mihi other times, and this is an attested part of Latin in the classical period that it was interchangeable. It's like a contraction. Some people say can't, others say cannot, depending on the emphasis they're putting on that kind of word in English, right? And in other languages, there are these kinds of contractions. So to hear this being done by the actor, I'm sure that this variety was deliberate and probably written into the translation by Alessandro, so I think it's really, really good here. So there is this variety. You can say it both ways. Which brings me to another topic. I have received some compliments and some non-compliments about how I say the word Latin, and I wanted to respond to that. So I'm American. My native language and pronunciation is called General American pronunciation of English. And in that pronunciation, normally the word is simply pronounced Latin, just as we say mitten or kitten and other wonderful things. That said, when we want to have extra clarity, we can say Latin, and that's fine. It is not an error. It is not non-native, because when we want to give that emphasis, we understand that the sound T can have it. We can add it on any final T or intervocalic T or wherever, and it's completely correct. We don't do it very often. I do it a lot when I'm teaching or making videos because it sounds like more clear speech in my own brain. It's a completely acceptable variant. You can say Latin, and it's totally correct English, especially for general American pronunciation. And you can say Latin, and it's totally correct English, also in general American pronunciation. So to that end, we see an interesting similar variety with mi and mihi used by the same actor, the same character, totally authentic. I love it.
Indicami ubi este Vōcēs.
The other part that is fantastic about this, which I know has annoyed several Latin teachers out there, is that he says indica mi ubi est Vōcēs instead of ubi sit Vōcēs. An indirect question should take the subjunctive, right? Well, in actual attested Roman literature, including the very words of Cicero, this sometimes happens. And so why is he saying it this way? Why did the translator deliberately put est instead of sit when he knows better? Well, because he wants Varus to sound more kind of common and normal. People have been asking me about Vulgar Latin. Oh, they should be speaking Vulgar Latin. This is Vulgar Latin. Vulgar Latin just means how normal people speak. That's it. And in this time period, this is an outstanding example of it. Moreover, in this time period, the difference between Vulgar Latin and Classical Latin is basically like the difference between how a novel is written today and how I'm speaking to you now. I'm just speaking to you in essentially vulgar English of this century, with some formality in my pronunciation, with some formality in my word choice, just because of the topic that we're talking about. There are not going to be enormous distinct differences between the common Vulgar Latin and Classical Latin in this period. So the way that everything is being said and written here is glorious. I love it. Nothing to say about these lines. I just wanted you to have the chance to hear them.
Roma alte de te gestit. Aeque tego.
So here, Varus is saying that he's proud of Arminius. Roma alte de te gestit. Pronunciation-wise, long vowels that you see indicated in my transcription aren't being well respected, but we know that's happening in most of these actors' voices, but it should sound something more like Romalte de te gestit, Romalte de te gestit. What's really interesting here is that the expression to be proud of someone doesn't seem to exist in Latin. There are ways to say to be prideful, boastful. Here from the wonderful Latinitium website, where there are fantastic dictionaries available made thanks to Daniel Pedersen and Johan Vinga, we have the Smith & Hall English to Latin dictionary entry here for proud, and we see all the entries, if they're not neutral, are negative. The closest one here which is given would be something like superbire, superbio, I am proud. For example, we see this reference in Ovid to be proud of the name of an ancestor. Nominavi superbio, or something like that. But as we see, the usage in Cicero is also negative, mighty or disdainful, high and mighty and disdainful. There's also efferre, but that also is insulenter se efferre, to be over prideful, and jactare, to be boastful. So there isn't this simple idiom that we use so frequently in English and other modern languages of, oh, I'm proud of you, my son or my friend. But to be proud of someone else is not really there. But yet it's part of the script that's been given to the translator, Alessandro Balistrieri. So what does he do? He invents an idiom based on some really great words. So we have the verb gestire. Gestire is essentially just to exalt, to be excited. We use it in Latin idiomatically to mean I'm looking forward to something. So gestio te videre, I'm looking forward to seeing you, that's one way to say that. So here, gestit, Rome exalts alte de te. It exalts highly about you. So Rome is proud of you. This exact construction I haven't found anywhere in Roman literature. That is the specific pairing of the verb gestire with alte, but it definitely makes sense to me nevertheless. And given that such an expression doesn't seem to exist in Latin anyway, and yet he had to translate it, I think the translator did really well here.
Roma alte de te gestit. Aeque tego.
Rogo transfera, pater.
I love how this sounds. He even has a nasal or highly reduced sounding final M. Rogo transferam, pater. His final O, also reduced in duration, which, as we've said many times, is totally normal for Classical Latin and Vulgar Latin. Rogo transferam. pater. Again, the actor has this beautiful retracted S sound, which I think is native to his German.
Rogo transfera, pater.
Doesn't that sound good? The transfera. It's like he's not really doing that M tightly or strongly. Sounds like a perfectly native sounding speaker. And when we look at Laurens and his actual lips here, they don't come together and it says transfera, pater. Look again.
Rogo transfera, pater.
Sounds so good. Sehr gut gemacht.
Romam russus quae sumerimitas.
Again, sounds good. Now, one of the things that helps him a lot here is that he's speaking quickly. Speaking quickly can do a lot to mask one's native accent if it's done in a way like this. He has all the long vowels here where they need to be. Roman rorsus quae sumerimitas, the final O, shortened. Very good conversational thing to do.
Romam russus quae sumerimitas.
Even the me is slightly longer than the re, which follows. So this sounds extremely good. He's got the geminated T, remitas. It sounds fantastic. And I did hear from him, by the way, the wonderful actor Laurens Rupp. And he told me that he did learn Latin in school, like many people do in Austria, but he never learned to speak it the way I've had the pleasure of doing and many other people have. And yet he acts this so well. So I'm really impressed. He said it was really difficult to do. I can only imagine trying to act in a language that I don't speak. As fun as it would be, and I'm sure it was fun, it's got to be hard to remember every little thing. And again, I'm nitpicking this as a fluent speaker of Latin who's very interested in classical Latin pronunciation. So you just have to admire these guys for what they're doing, because they really help our immersion and our enjoyment. So, vielen Dank.
Sin minus. In aliam provinciam, in Suriam, Hispaniam.
Lovely pronunciation of the U in the Suriam. Of course, as a German, he can do that without any issue. And he also says provinciam. And I also hear this fricativization, provinciam. It sounds like either a va or a va or something, the onset of this change of the sound of wa into something more fricativized. I don't know if that was deliberate or not, but it sounds like little features we'd expect to be evolving, to be existing, especially in younger people of this time period. A sound, again, he's not a native speaker of Latin, this character Arminius, but he picked it up pretty early in his life from other kids who may have had these traits. I love it.
Sin minus. In aliam provinciam, in Suriam, Hispaniam. Quocumque Romae prosim.
I adore this as well. Romae prosim. Romae. And Varus was doing this earlier too, and I praised him for it as well. It almost sounds like Romae or Rome or Rome, like a monophthong instead of a diphthong. Oh, it's so good because, again, rustic Latin, commonly spoken Latin, and eventually later forms of Latin will change the diphthong I into E. So this sounds utterly natural. The other thing, too, is because he's speaking quickly, I hear all the vowel lengths as correct, but because he's speaking quickly, it's not even giving him an opportunity to make an audible mistake. Now, that doesn't mean you can get away with just speaking Latin syllables really quickly, and then the perception of long and short syllables won't be there. I have a number of Spanish friends who have beautiful spoken Latin, but they don't pay very much attention to these sorts of things, and you can tell right away they're not geminating their consonants, they're not making the long vowels long where they need to be. But when Laurens does these long vowels, I can hear just slightly a little bit longer, and the short vowels slightly a little bit shorter, and they sound really good. It sounds super appropriately near native to me.
Sin minus. In aliam provinciam, in Suriam, Hispaniam. Quocumque Romae prosim.
The only thing, again, that might not be appropriate for Latin is that he says in Suriam, Hispaniam. He says it with a distinct final M. This might be a feature of his Germanic accent because I don't think Germanic languages at this time had a final nasal sound that was comparable to the same Latin one. So again, that's why I can forgive this character for not having something that sounds totally native. Nevertheless, I really love the features. I love the provinciam, the kind of a V sound that he's doing. In fact, when I heard him, I was like, is this actor Spanish? He's saying it with this slightly clipped, really kind of fast way. He has a little V in there. He has a retracted S. These, I guess, are just more of his Austrian accent, or maybe, I actually don't know. Laurens, kannst du Spanisch? There's something really authentic, really natural sounding about a lot of these features that I'm praising. And of course, I can give the actor a pass on anything like a final M, like Suriam, Hispaniam, with a distinct M sound at the end, because the character is not a native speaker. But where he does sound super classical, fantastic job. So I'm sorry, Gaetano, I have to be harder on you just because your character is a native speaker from Italy. Speaking of which, let's hear the last lines of this episode. It took me a while to transcribe that because I kept hearing Yamanutium. Wait, again, it's this schwa vowel, nuntium memisi. Like I heard me misi, but that's not what he's saying. He's saying Yanutium misi. Yanutium misi. I already sent a message. Yanutium misi. And those little schwas after the M's throw me way the heck off. But we've already discussed that. Other thing too, he's saying yam, and probably because the actual script that the actors have don't spell with a J like I do. And people have asked me, like, why are you spelling with a J? Well, the letter J, by the way, was invented by the Romans for a different purpose, but it actually predates the emergence of a distinction between a V and a U shape in the Roman alphabet. We'll talk about that another time. The point is that there are many times in written Latin that it's extremely confusing if there is the consonant sound ya, but it's written with the vowel letter I. It's really annoying, especially in poetry. That's why I recommend the spelling with a J, just like I recommend spelling with the letter V for the W sound, or however you want to pronounce it. It's much easier. It's part of normal, modern Latin spelling. Please use a J. You're welcome to do what you want. I think it's very useful pedagogically and aesthetically. That said, if the actor is looking at yam and it's written iyam, so it sounds like iyam to me, the way the actor's saying it, not yam, and I would blame that on orthography. Use the J.
Teque Caesari commendavi. Equestri dignitati obtinendae.
Really great stuff here. A lot of the same praise like normal. One thing that stands out is he says obtinendae, and he says ob, and that syllable between is super throwing me off. Now a b in front of a th, so letter B in front of a letter T, will become a B sound, a P, that is. English letter P, so it should be obtinendae. But he wants to do the b, so he's forcing the b and thus creating a schwa. So if you have a b next to a th, it has to become b, which we would write with the letter P. It has to be obtinendae. But he was trying to force this b sound, which is awkward, and because it's awkward, in fact, many Romans would write it with a P, the letter P here. It would be obtinendae, and that's how it ought to be pronounced.
Iam nuntium memisi. Teque Caesari commendavi. Equestri dignitati obtinendae.
The rest of the phrase sounds really good to me.
Sed tibi munus ultimum fungendum est.
Two things here stand out immediately. Sed the tibi, little schwa again, instead of allowing, and this is also partly because the d is a voiced consonant, and if you put that voiced consonant of the letter D next to the unvoiced T, there's an assimilation which occurs, so it should be a double or geminated T sound. So it should be sed tibi, and it could not be sed tibi. It could not be voiced unless there's a little vowel in there to give that space. So he wants the voice thing because he's reading the letter D, and maybe he wasn't coached in this particular thing. Also, it's hard to do unless you're really used to speaking Latin fluently to make it sed tibi.
Sed tibi munus ultimum fungendum est.
The other, you know what I'm about to say, fungendum est, the final M being pronounced, does not do that.
Onus legionis nostrae restituendust.
Here we have the masculine noun honos, honor, and we also see the very colloquial, very normal losing of the final S in restituendus est, restituendust, like the phrase opust, which we saw previously. Super good.
Onus legionis nostrae restituendust.
Also, listen to the syllable length in the first syllable of restituendust, the way this actor says it. It's really good.
Onus legionis nostrae restituendust.
Restituendust. He's that's what Italians do so well when they have closed syllables. They give them extra length, so it's restituendust instead of restituendust or something. It's restituendust. The actor does it flawlessly.
Onus legionis nostrae restituendust. Opus est humulcisci qui aquilam nostram rapuit. Gentem finesque tosti, fili mii. Reperies eum perfecto.
Sounds really good. My favorite part is we hear a long vowel in ulcisci. Sounds really good. Ulcisci. Instead of saying ulcisci or something, sounds like ulcisci. Sounds really good. I think his Italianness is helping him there. We also hear a final M pronounced in eumulkiski. Should be eulkiski. That final M ought not to be pronounced so distinctly. Otherwise, it sounds very fine.
Gentem finesque nosti, fili mihi, reperies eum profecto.
The E in fines is pronounced too short. He says fines instead of fines. So he says gentem finesque nosti instead of gentem finesque nosti. That would be the only thing to pick on that phrase.
Gentem finesque nosti, fili mihi, reperies eum profecto.
Oh, many people complained that he says fili mi a lot of times in this show. And fili mi is never tested in Roman literature. So you would think the contrary, which is what people were complaining about. Oh, the mi should come first. Because they found this to be awkward. Because they know Latin literature pretty well. And they see that mi fili, or rather mi pater, mi frater, and other expressions like that, with the mi first, are reasonably common in Latin literature, so this reversal seems wrong to them. However, how many times does mi fili occur? Once in all of Latin literature. So could the contrary not occur then? We only have one attestation. One attestation is not a really good statistic. You can find, though, if you search Latin literature with the wonderful PHI website, that mi, after a noun, to someone you're addressing, mel meum frater mi, and other expressions like that, they do occur. It is more frequent to have mi in front in most of Latin literature, but the opposite also occurs with the mi, or this possessive pronoun, oh dear of mine. Similar to figlio mio in modern Italian, it does occur in Latin literature. It's not wrong. The fact that Varus keeps saying it, maybe it's part of his accent, his particular dialect or variety of Latin and the way he speaks it natively. It's fine, it's attested, we don't need to complain about it.
Gentem finesque nosti, fili mihi, reperies eum profecto. Praeme ferto caputilius. Volquin. Wolsper.
All good stuff here. I have the same praise and the same tiny nitpicks. I particularly like, though, in this translation, it's ferto, which is the future imperative. That's a really cool imperative that Latin has. Do this thing in the future. I don't expect to do it right now. Ferto caputilius. So, bear his head. Praeme, in front of me, like bring his head to me. But in the future, ferto. Love it. Great job, translator Alessandro.
Praeme ferto caputilius. Volquin. Wolsper.
I just think it's wonderful and funny to hear this outstanding, classical-sounding Latin accent saying this foreign name. I think that's exactly how that name as written would be pronounced by a Roman. So, super cool. I had a ton of fun going over this second episode of Barbarians Latin with all of you. Do you want to see more? Do you want to hear about the Latin that's in episode 3? Leave a comment below. And if you want to hear Latin pronounced beautifully, even better than what we hear in Barbarians by a native Italian speaker, then definitely go to Metatron. He has a bunch of videos about Barbarians specifically and about Roman history, culture, and language in general. Fascinating stuff. Definitely subscribe to him. Huge thanks to all of my Patreon supporters who, in addition to getting lots of cool things, are also getting my complete transcriptions of all of these episodes. So if you want to have the text easy to copy and paste for your classrooms or any other purpose, you can get them by signing up to be a patron. But just the fact that all of you are watching this video and sharing it and liking it is incredibly helpful to the channel. It means a lot to me. Gratias vobis sago summas. In proximum. See you next time. Valete.